Packers Daily Fantasy Team Preview. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay. Taking a look at the Packers, a highly kind of efficient offense. Not so in 2015, but in previous years. You and I are both definitely looking for them to rebound here in 2016.
Yeah, I mean, just based on sort of Aaron Rodgers' career, I guess we'll get into him first. But quickly, it's kind of like when you look at what he did in 2015, 31 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, on 572 total attempts, less than 4,000 passing yards. This was the absolute floor for what an Aaron Rodgers season is going to look like. And I think everyone generally understands that, but I was reading Evan Silva's Roto-World sort of top 250 yesterday, and like it totally didn't even dawn on me. I was in on Rodgers this year, even before this, but he's been a top 2 fantasy quarterback in 6 of the last 8 years. Like, that is insane, especially with all the competition there is. So, I mean, I just think we're going to get back to vintage Aaron Rodgers again this year. He's pretty much in his prime for a quarterback in terms of, like, age. He's got all of his weapons back, and potentially an in-shape Eddie Lacy. I mean, I think we should hit first. You were talking before about their strength of schedule. I think that's something we should talk about. That's probably the most important heading into the season.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously in their division alone, Minnesota is the strongest defense they'll face. Detroit, middle of the road. Chicago, middle of the road. But then they play the AFC South and the NFC East. And then they'll play Seattle, which seems to be kind of a yearly game now. But they have a cupcake schedule. I mean, I think the AFC South is going to be something they'll dominate. But obviously the NFC East is something that really you look to really exploit when you're using, DFS players. So Rodgers should, I mean, as you mentioned, the floor, which is kind of laughable because I feel like we sort of kind of downgraded and ripped him a little bit last year. And that was such an above average season anyway, that because Aaron Rodgers' standards are so high, that looked bad. And he's going to come in and, be an efficient guy, 2 to 3 touchdowns a game. And, as you mentioned, Eddie Lacy, they didn't have that running attack to kind of balance things out. Now I'm expecting them to kind of be that uber efficient offense again.
And I mean, okay, so let's take a quick look down memory lane for a second. In his last 3 full seasons, he's thrown 45, 39, and 38 touchdowns. It's just unreal what he can do. We talk about the efficiency with Russell Wilson a lot now, but I think we kind of underrate how Aaron Rodgers is even more efficient than Russell Wilson over his career. So, I mean, he doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. So I just think week to week he's going to be the cash game quarterback of the year, especially with the way pricing has been on DK.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And the fact that he's getting Jordy Nelson back, and I think that was kind of one of the downgrades of why he was so I won't even call him inefficient. It was just lackluster in terms of what he's usually done. But now you toss Jordy Nelson back into the mix. And, there's also some, a little bit of question about how healthy he truly is, which I'm expecting him to be fine and to perform well. And kind of going into the receiving, I'm a big fan of Randall Cobb and kind of using him as a rebound guy because really you look at last year, and the only game that really stood out to me was the game against Kansas City where he caught 3 touchdowns. Outside of that, there really wasn't much from Randall Cobb on a week-to-week basis. So I'm kind of looking for him to kind of come back into that 1,000-yard season, 8 to 9 touchdowns, and kind of be a solid wide receiver 2 option again.
I'm totally with you. This is a guy who in his second season and third and fourth season caught over 70% of his passes. 61% last year is just not – that's horrible for a slot receiver, especially in an Aaron Rodgers offense. I mean, it just didn't make sense. And really what we saw was how important that number 1 receiver is. Cobb is not a full-blown number 1 receiver. Now, his talent and skill and what he brings to the table is worthy of sort of a prominent role and potentially a top role in an offense, but without a guy to take some of that coverage away, a lot of the stuff he does is neutralized. So with that deep threat back, I expect, like you said, a really nice rebound, and he's kind of the guy. I'm not as into Jordy this year as most people are, but I am really into Randall Cobb this year. I think he gets back to double-digit touchdowns, and like you were talking about, just back to what he was doing in the 2 previous years.
Yeah, and so I mean, we can kind of talk about Jordy Nelson. Obviously, coming off an injury, a severe injury. Jordy Nelson, I mean, personally, one of my favorite players in the league. Just one of those guys who, a true wide receiver one, yet kind of always flies under the radar in comparisons to Julio Jones and, obviously DeAndre Hopkins last year. But he was putting up just absolute stellar numbers, and a lot of it had to do with the chemistry with Rodgers. Just the numerous kind of breakdowns that they had, and Nelson would kind of be the go-to guy. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, personally, I do see kind of a step backwards just because I don't think a 13, 14 touchdown season is doable again for something we see Nelson do in the past. So I'm guessing where do you expect him to be come the end of the year?
So I'd say around 1,210 is a pretty fair, that's a fair rate, and I think he'll be efficient per target. He's going to have those big games where he catches those deep targets and sort of brushes off those corners or safeties that just aren't nearly big enough to take him down. But the storyline here is who emerges as that third receiver. We'll talk about Jared Cook in a second, but between Davante Adams, Ty Montgomery, Trevor Davis, Jeff Janis, Jared Abbrederis, there's a lot of guys there, and especially Montgomery and Adams, there's a lot of guys that the Packers spent a legitimate draft pick on. So I think that's the important storyline to follow, as well as Jared Cook in that range. But clearly we found out Davante Adams is not a number 1 receiver in the NFL based on what he did last year, which was, I mean, pathetic, to put it lightly. But at the same time, in that role the previous year, at the end of the year, he kind of emerged, including in the playoffs. So you don't get 94 targets in an offense just randomly, even with injuries to account for. So I do still think they have plans for him. Is he a number 1 target? No. Is he a number 2 target? No. But he could be still has a reasonable profile, still has a really strong collegiate and combine profile. So I do think there is potential for Adams, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if a Ty Montgomery sort of swoops in and steals that third receiver role.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think it might have been just a mentality thing with Adams. I mean, it's kind of tough to come in. I mean, it's easier to come into a situation when you're not expecting much of a person in comparison to when he jumped in at 2015 and needed to immediately make up production that Jordy Nelson kind of put on the table. So that could have been something. Maybe he does come in and plays a little bit better because he's not the focal point. He's not even a wide receiver too. He's a back end guy on a week to week basis. I don't see him truly being a real threat on a week to week basis with DFS. It would only maybe be so if they don't use the tight ends as much. Or that someone goes down. I think that's the only way he kind of creeps into being relevant.
Yeah, and for us Jared Cook truthers, this is the year. If it doesn't happen this year, we've spent a lot of time wasting precious, moments of our brain power. Like, I've spent a lot of brain power looking at Jared Cook and his measurables in mockdraftable.com. I threw him in there as running back once, and he's 100th percentile in everything. It's just kind of like Jared Cook, man. Dude's a freak athlete. He's shown signs. He loves the Arizona Cardinals when he was with the Rams. He'd get 2 touchdowns every time, basically. But we'll see. There is certainly upside with Aaron Rodgers, but there's just as good a chance as we see Richard Rodgers becoming the only tight end by week 5. There's also a very strong chance of that.
Yeah, it's certainly true. We'll take a look at the running game. Obviously, Eddie Lacy was a big disappointment last year after really a couple solid seasons to kind of start out his career. Um, yeah, James Starks, I mean, took a little away from him because he was inefficient. Because Starks was a little bit more viable in the passing game, he became a little bit better of an option on a week-to-week basis. I'm not putting 100% stock into Lacy, but I am a big fan of a rebound year for him just because, one, he's in shape. He's in one of the better offenses in the league where if you're completely balanced, like a Packers offense, your running game is going to be phenomenal. And he's at a point where I do expect him to get kind of, 4.3 to over, nearly 4.5 yards per carry in such a good offense.
Yeah, I'm with you. 4.1 yards per carry in a Packers offense isn't very good. Obviously, he was out of shape. If you followed football at all, then you knew the Eddie Lacy storyline. But I kind of like James Starks. They brought him back. Solid receiving down threat. If Lacy gets hurt, he's kind of jumps in and becomes the guy, and it's been this since Lacy kind of got there. And I think it's going to be more of the same. It always seems like Lacy's more exciting on paper than it actually turns out to be throughout the season. I mean, we just see Aaron Rodgers close to the goal line dumping it off to the random fullback or the random third tight end. And I just don't see how that's going to change, based on what we've seen in the last 8 years or so. So I think that's going to continue. I do like Lacy. I think he's going to be in cash game consideration some weeks, but I'm more looking forward to the week maybe he gets banged up and we get to throw Starks in there as the chalky cash game play.
Yeah, no, that's certainly an option that might happen throughout the year. And as you mentioned, I mean, with Jordy Nelson back, there's just another target in this Packers offense to kind of take away from production from others. And obviously the two tight ends are still there. It's going to be one of those scenarios where the offense, as far as outside of Aaron Rodgers, it's going to be kind of a little bit of variety, on a week-to-week basis. So I'm a fan of this Packers offense. I'm certainly intrigued with what they're going to do, obviously, given the schedule. One thing to talk about Lacy, I mean, if the Packers are kind of projected as big favorites, I think those are the weeks you maybe look to use them in cash games. Not more so in those kind of close shootout attempts. That's where you focus away and maybe even use the Starks.
And as we've seen in the Mike McCarthy era, they blow teams out in the first half and then really slow things down. Their pace just goes out the window, and it gets them in trouble a lot because they give up a lot of big leads. But they'll grind out the games with Eddie Lacy in the second half. So, like you mentioned, closer games might be better for the flow because they get stuck in those big leads, and it's like 3 and out. Rodgers isn't spreading the field as much, and they're just running it between the tackles for 3 straight downs.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as his defense goes, they were kind of underrated, I felt, last year. I do think, I mean, they were top 10 defense. They're still not a team that I completely shy away from. Obviously, I'll kind of use above average to elite players against them. But outside of that, this defense, I mean, should be pretty stout again.
Yeah, and we always see them having upside, especially based on the schedule. It seems like this Packers team should be out and ahead quite a bit, which always increases interception, return touchdowns, and all that type of good stuff. So Packers going to be an interesting GPP play again.
Yep, definitely agree with you. That's going to wrap it up with our Packers team preview. Be sure to check out the rest of our teams at dailyfantasycafe.com.